There is nothing like the feeling of being terrified and scared half to death when playing our favorite horror games. And with so many iconic horror games out there that explore new and inventive ways to scare the living hell out of us, video games continue to surprise us with terrifying moments, some of which will leave us with nightmares for weeks before we fully recover. And on this episode of Nerd Space Games, I'm recognizing the 10 most horrifying video games of all time. Before we get started, there are some ground rules that I want to go over. Firstly, I'm only including one game per franchise for this list. Also, I'm not including demos or playable trailers. Looking at you, PT. Finally, this list is completely my opinion, and in no way is this list the definitive list for scariest video games. With that in mind, feel free to leave a comment on today's video telling me what games did I miss and what game do you think is the scariest video game of all time. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. And also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, this is Nerd Space Games with my top 10 scariest horror games of all time. Let's get it. Number 10, Until Dawn. Until Dawn is a horror game that explores many different subgenres all in one game. Slasher, supernatural, paranormal, etc. So on paper, Until Dawn might look like a massive mess that tries to be too many things all at once. Yet what we get is easily one of the most horrifying experiences in video games. Taking a more narrative-driven and cinematic approach with its gameplay, Until Dawn follows 8 friends who find themselves in a living nightmare. With the traditional cabin in the woods setting, the player controls the decisions and movements of all 8 characters as they come face to face with a masked killer, wendigos, and even some spooky ass ghosts. Although the latter isn't really front and center except for a few jump scares by them here and there. Until Dawn leaves us terrified after completing the game thanks to the horrifying creature designs, gory yet satisfying kills, and some of the best jump scares of all time featured in video games. Number 9, Silent Hill 3. With PT out of the running, it became a real challenge trying to decide which Silent Hill game gave me the most goosebumps. Surprising nobody, I was between all 4 Team Silent games. But after much consideration, Silent Hill 3 outshined all of them when it came to the atmospheric horror, creature designs, and overall scare factor of the game. Silent Hill 3 included a return to one of the scariest locations ever, Brookhaven Hospital. While it was featured in Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3 made necessary improvements to the area to help it feel even scarier than before. Not to mention, Silent Hill 3 features some of the scariest moments of the franchise. Just to name a few, you have the bloody mannequin, the mirror that bleeds and eventually kills Heather, and even a haunted house that features a jump scare and a mysterious red light of doom. Because of the atmospheric horror created from the brilliant minds of Team Silent, some of the scariest locations like the Lakeside Amusement Park, and plenty of unnerving moments and jump scares to keep you on your toes, Silent Hill 3 cracks the list for one of the scariest horror games ever made. Number 8, Visage. Since I decided to be a dick about excluding PT on this list, I began scrambling through my mind to find the next best thing. And it didn't take me long to realize what was the best game inspired by PT, a psychological horror game called Visage. Just like PT, Visage begins with the player exploring a constantly changing house that eventually takes the form of many different images, from creepy courtyards to twisted halls to abandoned hospitals. Visage takes you on a journey that is both visually impressive and terrifying at the same time. Even before the first demonic ghost-like creatures begin stalking you, the eerie soundtrack, sound design, and fantastic set design of the game will leave you breathless and scared as hell at the same time. Then when you start finding yourself being chased by creepy ass ghosts and dark demonic figures, things immediately take a turn for the worse. I don't know if I could straight up say that this game is scarier than PT or not, but I can say that it's a full experience and one that is worth checking out if you love being scared of the dark. Number 7, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. The Fatal Frame series takes a unique approach to the survival horror genre as it exchanges guns and ammo for a camera and film. See, in the Fatal Frame series, you're challenged with facing your fears instead of shooting them or running away from them. In order to defeat the countless ghosts that you'll come across, you'll need to locate them with your camera and take pictures of them to defeat them. So, Fatal Frame immediately becomes one of the most terrifying horror franchises as it explores this more direct approach to dealing with the supernatural. Yet, Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly stands out even more as being the scariest game of the series. While every game features creepy ghosts and jump scares, Crimson Butterfly has some of the most iconic scares of the franchise. From facing off against the broken neck woman to the twin doll ghost to the falling woman, a spirit that keeps reliving her last moments of jumping off of the top floor over and over again. Yeah, the list goes on with the amount of terrifying moments in this game alone, and it's even worse when you realize that your only defense against these supernatural threats is a fucking camera. Number 6, Dead Space 2023. Before the remake of Dead Space, I would argue that Dead Space 2 is scarier than the original Dead Space. However, thanks to the many new features and new improvements made to the game, Dead Space 2023 is now the scariest game of the franchise. And for good reason. Going off of the traits brought from the original game, Dead Space was already regarded as a truly terrifying sci-fi horror. I mean, the original game focused on Isaac Clarke as he explored a broken down spaceship with limited power, which meant that everywhere you went was filled with dark corners. Then when you add in the zombie-like alien creatures that could only be killed by completely removing all of their limbs, then yeah, this game seemed like the perfect sci-fi horror already. Yet the remake found ways to improve the horror elements of this already scary game drastically. For one, the sound design was improved to where you can now hear each and every sound made around you as you're exploring this dark and spooky ship. Of course, this made each area that much more terrifying to explore. Yet the most horrifying change comes from a new mechanic introduced in the remake: dynamic events. This feature allowed the game to change and adapt to the way you're playing the game, making each playthrough of Dead Space a little different. These events included more necromorphs climbing out of the vents to attack you, or even more jump scares in areas that you find yourself exploring for a really long time. Number 5, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. Probably the most underrated horror game on this list, Eternal Darkness was a horror game exclusive to the Nintendo GameCube. Because it was only released on a Nintendo console, this horror game flew under the radar despite having some of the best mechanics seen in horror games. While the story was completely bonkers and the combat was kinda rough, to this day Eternal Darkness remains as one of the scariest games that I've ever played. And yeah, the jump scares played a massive part in that, but it was actually the use of a pretty unique and creative mechanic that helped elevate the scare factor: the Sanity meter. While a Sanity meter could be seen in other games, such as the Amnesia series, the way it was handled in Eternal Darkness helps the game stand out from most other horror games. The Sanity meter in this game, when filled, could cause hallucinations. These hallucinations would play tricks on not just the character, but even the player by breaking the fourth wall. Sure, we got iconic jump scares from the woman in the bath and from the hanging man, but some of the best scares came from the game breaking the fourth wall. For example, the game might pretend to turn off the TV or mute the volume, or your character could have their head cut off while still moving, or even have roaches run across the screen. It was a creative way to scare the player by using this Sanity meter to break the fourth wall, which completely shocked most people playing it for the first time. Number 4, Resident Evil 7 VR. Regardless of the way you look at it, a Resident Evil game was destined to crack this list. The bigger issue was trying to decide which one. While the 2002 remake of Resident Evil comes to mind as being the best when it comes to atmospheric horror, and both RE2 remake and the original RE3 being terrifying thanks to the clever use of Mr. X and Nemesis, Resident Evil 7 on VR takes the cake as being the scariest game of the franchise. Now look, I've gone back and forth about this. Hell, literally 2 months ago, I did a ranking on the scariest Resident Evil games, and I put the 2002 remake as number 1. But if I'm taking VR into consideration, then it becomes that much more difficult to rank Resident Evil 7 under Resident Evil. So this time around, I gotta go with the VR mode of RE7. Anyway, Resident Evil 7 reinvents the franchise once again, only this time it goes with a more horror-focused direction that puts the player in first person. For this reason, it was the perfect fit for VR. While the 7th installment was terrifying on its own and easily deserves the second scariest title of the franchise without the use of VR, the scare factor is increased dramatically when you throw yourself into the world of virtual reality. To this day, I would argue that Resident Evil 7 is the best VR horror game. Hell, I would argue that it's one of the best VR games in general. Using the VR capabilities, you can put yourself face first against the terrifying Baker family. Marguerite Baker never looked more horrifying than she did on VR. Jack Baker's footsteps being heard behind you as you ran in VR gave you that much more anxiety as you heard them coming closer. Even Mia's opening scenes on VR left me scarred and unable to complete the game for a few days after seeing the possessed Mia crawl up the basement stairs like she was straight out of an Exorcist movie. All of these factors play a major part as to why Resident Evil 7 VR is easily one of the scariest games of all time. Number 3, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. From this point on, you'll probably notice a trend as we make our way to number 1. But first, we take a look at a horror game that completely scared the living hell out of us gamers: Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Before PT and other first-person psychological horror games that followed in its footsteps, Frictional Games hit the scene with a few of their own games within that genre, including The Dark Descent. Starting with the atmospheric horror setting that put us in the shoes of Daniel, a man with amnesia who is exploring a truly horrifying castle. As we made our way deeper into this castle, we began to come face to face with monsters that would forever be engraved into our minds: the Gatherers. These victims of torture and experimentation would stalk us through the halls as we try to figure out who we are and what are we here to do. Since The Dark Descent, like most Amnesia games, didn't give us many ways to combat these disturbing creatures, the player was forced to hide away in dark areas and wardrobes to escape them, listening to the unsettling sounds that the Gatherers made while they searched for you. As you hid in a nearby wardrobe left you tense and nervous from the fear of being found. On top of that, you had limited resources to use as a light source. Oil for your lantern or matches used for lighting torches were limited and were your only source of light when exploring the darkest and deepest parts of this castle. But let's not forget about the sanity meter that'll cause your vision to get blurry and hallucinate if you spend too much time in the dark or staring at a gatherer. Overall, Amnesia: The Dark Descent was a horror masterpiece that definitely earns its spot on today's list of scariest games of all time. Number 2, Alien Isolation. Plenty of other horror games have explored a lot of the elements found in Alien Isolation, but most didn't live up to what this game was able to do with those traits. The game follows Amanda Ripley, Ella Ripley's daughter, who finds herself at a space station where she's battling androids and, most of all, a xenomorph. While Dead Space may be the first sci-fi horror game that we think of on the spot, and Nemesis or Mr. X comes to mind first when we think of a stalker enemy, I would argue that Alien Isolation is a better sci-fi horror than Dead Space, and the Xenomorph is a better stalker enemy than both Nemesis and Mr. X. Actually, a big reason why Alien Isolation is so scary comes from the Xenomorph itself. Instead of being your typical brain-dead stalker enemy, the Xenomorph demonstrates intelligence that far exceeds most enemy AIs in video games. Because the Xenomorph learns from your playstyle and adapts to it, you'll find yourself completely outsmarted and caught off guard throughout the game. My favorite moment from this game comes from when I first started to encounter the Xenomorph. Every time it showed up, I found myself the nearest locker and hid in it until it was far from me. Apparently, I had done this so much that the Xenomorph began to check the nearby lockers. So imagine my shock when it ripped the locker door off its hinges and killed me instantly for the first time. Since the Xenomorph was basically indestructible every time it showed up, fear and anxiety wasn't far behind. Trying to outsmart an enemy that would adapt to your playstyle proved to be difficult and would lead to some of the most disturbing jump scares in video games. Number 1. Outlast.
Little pig.
Found footage movies have always left me the most scared. When I think of a Blair Witch Project or Paranormal Activity, I think of how scared I was to sleep after watching them. And while Outlast isn't technically a found footage game, it does play with the idea of it a little, as you'll be using a video camera as your primary source of light throughout the game. Of course, this alone isn't enough to be the scariest game ever made, but when you start to encounter the many terrifying things awaiting for you in the Mount Massive Asylum, this mechanic adds a new layer of fear as you explore the dark secrets hidden in this hospital. To start with, the game features more jump scares than any other horror game out there. And I don't mean the petty jump scares that don't make you feel anything. I mean good, clever jump scares that force you to pause the game so that you can take a moment to breathe. From stalker enemies that pop up at unexpected moments to a simple enemy waiting around the corner as you crawl through an opening, the game definitely keeps your heart racing more than most horror games out there. While we're on the topic of stalker enemies, by the way, the first Outlast game features not one, but two of the most terrifying stalker enemies in video games. Traeger plays more on the disturbing side of horror, while Chris Walker is your more traditional stalker enemy that'll make you sweat each time he appears on screen. Due to the use of a Blair Witch style of horror with the use of a video camera, two relentless stalker enemies that keeps your heart racing, in an asylum setting that rivals most settings in horror games, and the limited resources and lack of ways to fight back against the enemies of the game, Outlast, in my opinion, is the scariest horror game of all time. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Outlast the scariest horror game out there, or is there a different game that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.